It's 2:47 in the morning, 18 September 1943, and somewhere in the silent darkness between two occupied cities, a train begins a journey it will never finish. The cold night air hangs heavy over the railway line, stretching endlessly into blackness, the steel tracks faintly reflecting moonlight, like a path carved through shadow. A freight locomotive groans to life. Pulling behind it 37 wagons loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and winter uniforms, lifelines for soldiers fighting far from home. To anyone watching, it's just another routine movement, in a war defined by routine logistics. But tonight, something is different, something invisible, something already set in motion hours before the engine even started. Inside the locomotive, the driver checks his gauges with quiet confidence. Everything is normal, pressure steady, fuel levels fine. The engine hums exactly the way it should. He's driven this route so many times it's become second nature. Track memorized, turns anticipated, distances felt rather than measured. There's no reason to suspect anything unusual. Behind him in the brake van, 3 German guards sit wrapped in their coats, cigarettes glowing faintly as they complain about the cold and the boredom. For them, this is just another uneventful escort mission. No gunfire, no ambush, no resistance fighters lurking in the trees. Just rails, steel, and silence. But beneath them, clinging to the underside of the fuel tender, is something none of them can see. A small device. Compact, silent, patient. It doesn't tick loudly like a clock. It doesn't flash or vibrate in any noticeable way. Instead, it listens. It counts. Every vibration of the train wheels rolling over rail joints sends tiny pulses through the metal body, feeding into a mechanism designed not for speed, but for perfect timing. It has already been placed, already activated, already waiting, and it will not make a mistake. As the train continues north, the darkness thickens. Villages pass unnoticed. Forests blur into shadow. Hours slip by without incident. Everything appears calm, controlled, predictable. The kind of calm that only exists right before something catastrophic happens. No alarm sound. No guards react. No one senses a countdown quietly reaching its final moments. Then, at exactly 4:14 in the morning, as the locomotive begins crossing a bridge over the Saron River, the waiting ends. The explosion doesn't begin as a single blast. It erupts. A violent tear of fire and pressure rips through the fuel tender, shattering steel like paper. Fuel lines rupture instantly, spraying burning diesel across the wagons behind. Within seconds, flames spread uncontrollably, licking across crates of ammunition stacked tightly in the freight cars. And then comes a second wave, the one that turns destruction into chaos. Secondary detonations. One after another, shells ignite. Explosives cook off. The entire train becomes a chain reaction of firepower unleashed in the worst possible place. Mid-bridge, suspended above a river, nowhere to escape. The sound carries for miles, echoing to the countryside like thunder rolling across the night. People wake in distant villages, not knowing what they've just heard, only that something massive has happened. By the time dawn finally breaks, the scene is almost unrecognizable. The bridge is gone. Not damaged, not weakened, gone. Twisted metal lies scattered across the riverbank. Wagons are torn apart, some half submerged in water, others reduced to burning wreckage. The locomotive itself is barely intact, its frame mangled beyond recognition. Supplies meant to sustain entire battalions, winter gear, ammunition, medical stock, are either destroyed or lost. The scale of the loss is staggering. And yet, no one attacked the train. No ambush, no gunfire, no resistance fighters hiding nearby, because no one needed to be there. The people responsible were already miles away long before the explosion ever happened, safe, unseen, and impossible to trace. That's what makes this moment so terrifying, not just for the Germans witnessing the aftermath, but for the entire system they depended on. This wasn't just sabotage. This was something far more dangerous. This was sabotage that could wait, and that single idea, waiting, would begin to change everything. By 1942, the war across occupied Europe had reached a brutal stalemate in many ways. Germany controlled vast territories, And with that control came a logistical challenge unlike anything seen before. Troops needed to be moved. Weapons had to be delivered. Supplies had to reach front lines stretching from freezing northern regions all the way down to the deserts of North Africa. And the backbone of all of it, the lifeline holding the entire system together, was the railway network. Thousands upon thousands of miles of track. At any given moment, thousands of trains moving simultaneously, each one carrying something critical: fuel, ammunition, food, uniforms, reinforcements. It wasn't just transportation. It was circulation, like blood moving through veins, keeping the entire war machine alive and functioning. And that created a problem, because if you wanted to stop that machine, you had to find a way to cut those veins. But how do you do that when the network is everywhere? Traditional sabotage had already proven its limits. Resistance fighters would risk everything to cut rails, blow bridges, or derail trains, but every attempt came with enormous danger. Teams had to physically be at the location. They had to work under pressure, often at night, with patrols constantly moving nearby, and the consequences of failure were brutal. German forces responded with ruthless precision. Patrols walked the tracks regularly. Bridges were heavily guarded. Entire villages faced destruction if even a single act of sabotage occurred nearby. The cost wasn't just operational, it was human. Lives were lost not just among fighters, but among innocent civilians caught in retaliation. And worst of all, even when sabotage succeeded, it didn't last. Bridges were repaired. Tracks were relayed. Trains resumed movement sometimes within hours. The system absorbed the damage and kept going, which meant the resistance faced an impossible equation: high risk, low long-term impact, and devastating losses for every success. Something had to change. Not just a method, but the entire way sabotage was approached. Because the real problem wasn't just where to strike. It was when, to destroy a target effectively, you had to be there at the exact right moment, when the most valuable cargo was passing through. But the Germans knew this too. They changed schedules. They used decoy trains. They moved critical supplies unpredictably. The window of opportunity became almost impossible to predict. So the resistance needed something different. Not faster, not bigger, smarter. They needed a weapon that didn't rely on being present at the moment of attack. A weapon that could be placed in advance, left behind, and trusted to do its job later, far away from the person who deployed it. A weapon that could wait in silence, hidden unnoticed, counting down to a moment no one could predict. And once that idea took hold, everything began to shift, because somewhere in a quiet workshop far from the front lines, that exact solution was already being built. And that solution would soon become one of the most feared invisible threats in the entire war. Because far from the noise of battle, inside a quiet English countryside house hidden behind ordinary walls, a group of scientists, engineers, and unconventional thinkers were solving a problem no army had been able to crack. This wasn't a battlefield innovation born under fire. It was something colder, more calculated, a weapon designed not just to destroy, but to outthink an entire system. The place was known simply as a Fry, a requisitioned country estate in Hertfordshire, turned into a secret research station by Britain's Special Operations Executive. Inside, there were no marching soldiers or roaring engines. Instead, there were tables covered in wires, chemicals, metal casings, and prototypes, each one representing a different attempt to change how war was fought behind enemy lines. The challenge they faced was clear. Create something small enough to be hidden, powerful enough to destroy critical targets, and smart enough to work without the operator being anywhere nearby. And after countless trials, failures, and refinements, they finally had it. They called it the Clam. At first glance, it didn't look like a revolutionary weapon. In fact, it looked almost unimpressive. Roughly the size of a large book, weighing just under 6 pounds, with a simple rectangular shape that could easily be concealed under clothing or inside a tool bag. But its true power wasn't how it looked. It was in what it could do once placed. At its core, the Clam was a magnetic explosive charge. Strong magnets built into its base allowed it to clamp tightly onto any steel surface. Locomotives, wagons, fuel tanks, anything made of metal. Once attached, it could stay in place even under the intense vibrations and movement of a moving train. But magnets alone weren't a breakthrough. The real innovation, the thing that changed everything, was hidden inside, a timing mechanism unlike anything used before. Until this point, most explosive devices relied on mechanical timers, clockwork systems that tick down audibly, prone to failure, sensitive to shock, and often unreliable in harsh conditions. But the engineers at the Fry had taken a completely different approach. Instead of gears and ticking clocks, they turned to chemistry. Inside the clam was a simple but brilliant system, a spring-loaded striker held in place by a thin wire. That wire passed through a tiny glass ampoule filled with corrosive acid. When the device was activated, the operative would crush a small copper tube, releasing the acid onto the wire. And from that moment, the countdown began, not with sound, but with corrosion. The acid would slowly eat through the wire at a predictable rate. No ticking, no moving parts, just silent, invisible chemical action. And depending on the type of acid used, each stored in different color-coded ampoules, the delay could be controlled with surprising precision. 6 hours, 12 hours, 2 days, even up to an entire week. Think about what that meant. A resistance fighter could place a device under a train, walk away, and the explosion wouldn't happen until that train had traveled miles, far from the point of placement, far from witnesses, far from any connection to the person who said it. That single idea changed the rules completely, because now, sabotage didn't require presence. It required patience. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. Temperature changes, humidity, and slight variations in materials could shift the timing by a margin, sometimes up to 20%. But in the chaos of war, that level of accuracy was more than enough. The goal wasn't second-by-second precision. The goal was unpredictability. And the clam delivered exactly that. The explosive charge itself was equally effective, a carefully balanced mixture of RDX and TNT, designed not just to create a blast, but to maximize fragmentation and ignite fires instantly. 6 pounds might not sound like much, but when placed directly against a fuel tank or beneath a wagon loaded with ammunition, it became devastating. It didn't just destroy, it triggered chain reactions. And that's what made it so dangerous. But a weapon is only as effective as the people using it. And getting the clam into the hands of resistance fighters across occupied Europe was its own challenge. Training, surprisingly, wasn't the issue. The device was simple enough that operatives could learn how to use it in under 2 hours. Attach, activate, leave. That was it. The real difficulty was access. How do you get close enough to a train, under heavy guard, in occupied territory, without being caught? The answer came from within the system itself. Railway workers. Across France and other occupied regions, many railway employees secretly supported the resistance. They had something no outsider could replicate: access, familiarity, and routine. A worker in a shunting yard could move between wagons without raising suspicion. He could crouch beneath a stationary train during a shift change, pretending to inspect something, while in reality attaching a clam to the underside of a fuel tender. No dramatic infiltration, no gunfight, just a quiet moment and a small device left behind. Once set, the operative would walk away, blending back into normal life. Hours later, sometimes the next day, the explosion would occur somewhere entirely different, leaving German forces confused, frustrated, and unable to trace the source. And slowly, these attacks began to add up. One train lost here, another destroyed miles away, supplies disappearing without warning. No pattern, no clear point of failure, just random, devastating disruptions. Between 1943 and 1944, dozens of confirmed attacks were recorded, but the true number was almost certainly much higher. Many explosions were never officially attributed to sabotage at all, simply because there was no evidence left behind. And that uncertainty, that lack of answers, began to spread fear, because now every train could be a target. Every journey could be its last. German guards could search the tracks, patrol bridges, inspect cargo, but they couldn't guard against something that might have been placed hours or even days earlier. They couldn't protect against a threat that was already inside their system, waiting quietly for the right moment. And that's when the psychological impact began to take hold. Drivers hesitated. Guards grew paranoid. Workers questioned every route, because somewhere on some train, another device was already counting down, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. This wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was uncertainty weaponized, and as its use spread beyond France into other occupied regions, the scale of its impact would only grow, turning isolated acts of sabotage into a widespread, invisible war happening right beneath the surface. And as its use spread beyond France into other occupied regions, the scale of its impact would only grow, turning isolated acts of sabotage into a widespread, invisible war happening right beneath the surface. Because once the Klan proved that it could work, it didn't stay limited to one country or one group. It began to move quietly, secretly, across borders, carried in supply drops, hidden in crates, passed hand to hand between resistance networks that had been waiting for something exactly like this. In Yugoslavia, where partisan fighters were already locked in constant against German forces, the arrival of these devices changed the rhythm of their operations almost overnight. Unlike the smaller, more cautious resistance cells in Western Europe, Yugoslav partisans operated in larger, more aggressive formations, but even they understood the advantage of a weapon that didn't require direct confrontation. Railway lines connecting critical supply routes, from Belgrade down toward Greece, became silent hunting grounds. One partially declassified report, released decades later, describes a single operation where just one clam device was attached to a freight train carrying artillery shells. No ambush, no explosives planted on tracks. Just one device placed carefully beneath a wagon. Hours later, far down the line, the explosion triggered a massive chain reaction that destroyed 19 wagons completely. 19, not damaged, destroyed. Supplies meant for entire divisions gone in seconds. And again, no one was there to witness it happen. That pattern repeated itself in different forms across occupied Europe. Small actions, massive results. The Klan didn't need large teams, heavy equipment, or coordinated attacks. It relied on something far more powerful: timing, invisibility, and trust in a system that would work even when the operator was long gone. But if the physical destruction was significant, the psychological damage was even greater. Because war is not just fought with bullets and bombs, it's fought in the mind. And the Klan attacked the mind directly. German railway crews began to change. At first, it was subtle: a hesitation before departure, a longer inspection under the train, a second look at something that probably wasn't there. But as more unexplained explosions occurred, that hesitation turned into something deeper: fear. Because how do you defend against something you cannot see, cannot hear, and cannot predict? Every train became a question mark. Every route felt dangerous. Drivers began refusing certain assignments. Some claimed illness. Others simply didn't show up. Locomotives sat idle in sidings, not because they were damaged, but because no one was willing to take the risk of driving them. Guard became more aggressive, more suspicious, searching workers, checking equipment, trying desperately to find something, anything, that would explain what was happening. But they found nothing. Because there was nothing obvious to find. The devices were too small, too well hidden, too easily concealed within the normal complexity of a train's undercarriage. Even when inspections were intensified, floodlights installed in maintenance pits, random searches increased, schedules changed unpredictably, it didn't solve the problem. If anything, it made things worse. Because now the Germans were reacting to something they didn't understand. They varied schedules to avoid predictable patterns. But the Klan didn't care about schedules. It wasn't waiting for a specific time. It was waiting for a process to complete. They added more guards. But guards couldn't watch every inch of every train at every moment. They increased patrols. But patrols only worked against threats that were present in real time. This threat wasn't. It had already happened. And that realization created a kind of paranoia that spread faster than any physical damage ever could. Reports from the time described railway personnel as increasingly unreliable, not because they lacked discipline, but because they were operating under constant, invisible pressure. Every vibration of the train could be imagined as a countdown. Every unusual sound could trigger panic. The war had followed them onto the tracks, and now it was inside their heads. Of course, the Germans weren't blind to innovation. They attempted to develop their own version of magnetic sabotage devices. One such effort resulted in a weapon known as the Half-Ledung, a magnetic anti-tank mine, adapted for different uses. On paper, it seemed similar. Magnetic attachment, explosive charge, potential for sabotage. But in practice, it failed to match the clam's effectiveness. The problem wasn't the concept. It was the execution. German devices relied heavily on mechanical timing systems, clockwork mechanisms that produced noise, required precise handling, and were far more prone to failure under real-world conditions. Compared to the silent chemical fuse of the clam, these systems felt outdated and unreliable, and reliability was everything. A device that fails half the time doesn't just lose effectiveness, it destroys confidence. There was another critical difference, too: distribution. The British designed the clam specifically for resistance use. It was meant to be deployed widely, used by civilians, railway workers, small sabotage teams, anyone who could get close enough to the target. The Germans, on the other hand, kept their devices restricted to specialized units. They didn't trust irregular forces in occupied territories. They didn't build a network around the weapon, and without that network, the weapon couldn't scale. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Americans developed their own magnetic mines, most notably the M1 limpet mine. It saw success in naval operations, particularly against ships in the Pacific. But again, differences mattered. The American version was larger, heavier, nearly twice the weight of the clam, and its timing mechanisms never quite reached the same level of precision or flexibility. In a comparative analysis conducted later in the war, estimates suggested that British clam devices achieved a success rate of roughly 7 successful detonations out of 10 placements. German equivalents lagged far behind, often achieving only 1 in 3. That gap wasn't just technical. It was strategic, because the clam wasn't just a device. It was part of a system built on simplicity, reliability, and the ability to disappear. And that system allowed it to be used again and again and again without exposing the people behind it. Even Soviet partisans received shipments of these devices through northern convoy routes. Those Soviet tactics often favor more direct, high-risk sabotage, larger teams, bigger explosives. The clam still found its place. But their approach to war was different. Where Western resistance groups prioritized survival and sustainability, Soviet operations often accepted higher losses in exchange for immediate impact. Still, the principle remained the same. A weapon that could wait was a weapon that changed the rules. And as more of these devices found their way onto trains, onto supply routes, onto critical infrastructure, the impact began to show, not just in destroyed wagons or delayed shipments, but in something much larger: the gradual breakdown of confidence in the entire railway system. Because when a system depends on predictability and you remove that predictability, the system begins to fail from within. And by the time German command started to fully understand what they were facing, the damage had already gone far beyond physical destruction, reaching into the very efficiency of their war machine itself. And by the time German command started to fully understand what they were facing, the damage had already gone far beyond physical destruction, reaching into the very efficiency of their war machine itself, because what had begun as scattered, almost untraceable incidents was now forming a pattern, one that didn't point to a single location, a single group, or even a single method, but instead pointed to something far more dangerous, a system under invisible attack from within. German logistics reports from late 1942 into 1944 began to reflect this shift. At first, the language was cautious, mentions of unexpected losses, unexplained delays, and irregular disruptions. But as the months passed, the tone changed. Frustration became clear. Repeated references appeared to trains that never reached their destination, to shipments that vanished somewhere along the route, to locomotives that were found destroyed without any evidence of direct sabotage on the tracks themselves. It didn't make sense, at least not in the traditional understanding of warfare, because there were no blown rails, no destroyed bridges, at least not beforehand, no signs of resistance fighters operating in the immediate area, just trains leaving one point and never arriving at the next. And slowly, the realization began to sink in. The threat wasn't on the tracks. It was already on the train. That single shift in understanding changed everything. And yet, even with that knowledge, the Germans found themselves unable to respond effectively, because knowing a threat exists and being able to stop it are two very different things. They increased inspections, of course. Maintenance crews were ordered to check undercarriages more thoroughly. Guards were told to remain alert, to watch for suspicious behavior, to question workers more aggressively. Inspection pits were flooded with light, turning once shadowed areas into brightly illuminated spaces where nothing should be able to hide. But the clam didn't need much space to hide. It didn't need complicated placement. And most importantly, it didn't need to stay there for long. A device could be attached in seconds, during a shift change, during a moment of distraction, during the countless routine interactions that made up daily railway operations. And once it was in place, it became part of the train. Just another piece of unseen machinery among dozens of pipes, brackets, and metal structures. Finding it was like searching for a single grain of sand in a moving machine. And missing it had consequences. So the Germans adapted again. They changed schedules even more frequently, hoping unpredictability would break the pattern. They introduced decoy trains, sending empty wagons along certain routes to confuse potential saboteurs. They even considered rerouting critical supplies by road, slower, less efficient, but potentially safer. But none of it solved the core problem, because the clam didn't rely on knowing schedules. It didn't rely on targeting a specific train at a specific time. It relied on probability, placing up devices, and eventually, the right train would carry one. And when that happened, the result would be catastrophic. Estimates from the period vary, but German records suggest that between 200 and 600 locomotives were destroyed or severely damaged in France alone between 1943 and 1944 due to sabotage. Not all of these incidents can be directly attributed to clam devices, but the pattern of delayed, unexplained explosions appears again and again throughout these reports. And more importantly, the effect wasn't just measured in destroyed equipment. It was measured in lost efficiency. Railway traffic slowed. Delays increased. Critical supplies arrived late, or not at all. And to compensate, German command had to make difficult decisions. More guards were assigned to railway duty, men who would otherwise have been deployed at the front. More resources were diverted toward inspections, maintenance, and security measures that, in many cases, produced no results. It was a drain, not dramatic, not immediate, but constant. And in war, constant pressure can be more damaging than a single massive blow. There's a translated memo from April 1944, originating from German security services, that describes railway crews as psychologically unreliable. Think about what that means. Not physically incapable, not poorly trained, but mentally affected, distrustful, hesitant. That's not something you can fix with more guards or better equipment. That's something that spreads. Because once fear enters a system, it doesn't stay contained. A driver hesitates, another notices. A crew refuses a route, others question why. A delay occurs, and suddenly everyone is wondering if they're next. And that's how disruption multiplies without a single additional explosion. The clam didn't just destroy trains. It created doubt, and doubt slowed everything down. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the success of these operations didn't go unnoticed. The clam wasn't just a temporary solution. It was becoming a model, a proof of concept that small, intelligently designed devices could have a disproportionate impact on a much larger enemy system. The chemical time delay fuse, in particular, attracted significant attention. Its simplicity, reliability, and silence made it ideal for a wide range of applications beyond railway sabotage. In the years that followed, similar principles would be adapted into other military demolition tools, influencing designs well into the Cold War. Magnetic attachment systems also evolved. The idea that a device could be quickly attached to metal surfaces without tools opened the door for underwater mines, covert demolition charges, and eventually even improvised devices used in later conflicts. But during the war itself, the clam remained something unique, because it wasn't just about technology. It was about strategy. It represented a shift away from direct confrontation towards something more subtle, more controlled, more patient. A way of fighting that didn't require overwhelming force, just the ability to exploit weaknesses in an opponent's system. And the German railway network, for all its scale and efficiency, had a weakness. It depended on trust. Trust that trains would arrive. Trust that cargo was safe. Trust that what you couldn't see wasn't there. The clam broke that trust. And once broken, it couldn't easily be restored. Even after increased security, even after countless inspections, even after adapting procedures and diverting resources, the uncertainty remained. Because every train that left the station carried a question with it. Is this the one? And there was no way to know until it was too late. Because somewhere on some train, another device was already counting down. Quietly, patiently, inevitably. And by the time the war began shifting in favor of the Allies, the impact of that quiet, invisible sabotage had already helped weaken one of the most critical systems holding the German war effort together. And by the time the war began shifting in favor of the Allies, the impact of that quiet, invisible sabotage had already helped weaken one of the most critical systems holding the German war effort together. Because while tanks, aircraft, and frontline battles often define how wars are remembered, it's the systems behind those battles, the supply lines, the logistics, the constant flow of resources, that truly determine how long an army can keep fighting. And in that hidden layer of warfare, the clam had done something extraordinary. It didn't destroy everything at once. It didn't need to. Instead, it worked slowly, methodically, creating a steady stream of disruption that never fully stopped. One train destroyed here, another delayed there, a shipment lost, a route avoided, a crew unwilling to move forward. On their own, these incidents might seem small, almost insignificant compared to the scale of global war. But together, they form pressure, relentless pressure, the kind that builds over time until an entire system begins to strain under its own weight. German command found themselves forced into difficult compromises. Railways were no longer fully reliable, yet they remained essential. Road transport could be used as an alternative, but it came with its own limitations. Slower speeds, higher fuel consumption, greater exposure to air attacks. Every adjustment created new vulnerabilities, new inefficiencies, new problems to solve. And all of it traced back to a weapon that rarely appeared, rarely revealed itself, and yet was always present in the minds of those who had to keep the system running. Because by now, the fear wasn't just about explosions. It was about inevitability, the understanding that somewhere, at some point, another detonation would occur, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it completely. That kind of uncertainty doesn't just disrupt operations. It changes behavior. And behavior is what systems are built on. Crews became cautious to the point of hesitation. Inspections became longer, more detailed, more frequent, slowing down the very efficiency the railway network depended on. Resources were diverted not toward expansion or improvement, but toward protection, defense, reaction. And still, it wasn't enough. Because the clam didn't need to be everywhere. It just needed to be somewhere. And that was enough to affect everything. Looking back, historians face a challenge when trying to measure the exact impact of such a weapon. Covert operations rarely leave complete records. Some successes were never documented. Others may have been exaggerated or misattributed. Numbers vary. Estimates suggest hundreds of locomotives destroyed or damaged, thousands of tons of supplies lost. But the true figure will likely never be known with certainty. But impact isn't always about numbers. Sometimes it's about influence. And the influence of the clam can be seen clearly in the way it changed thinking on both sides of the war. For the Allies, it proved that small, intelligent tools could achieve results far beyond their size. It reinforced the value of special operations, of working with resistance networks, of empowering individuals to make a difference in a much larger conflict. It showed that warfare didn't always have to be loud, direct, or immediate to be effective. And for the Germans, it revealed a vulnerability they could never fully close, a gap between control and certainty. Because no matter how many guards were deployed, how many inspections were conducted, how many procedures were updated, they could never guarantee that a train was safe once it left the station. That doubt remained. And in war, doubt is a powerful enemy. Today, a few surviving examples of these devices exist in museums. Silent, inert, their mechanisms no longer active. To a casual observer, They might seem unimpressive, small, simple, easy to overlook. But those who understand their history see something very different. They see an idea that redefined sabotage, an idea that turned absence into strength. Because traditionally, power in war came from presence, being there, holding ground, applying force directly against the enemy. But the clam flipped that concept completely. It proved that you didn't have to be present to have impact, that you could act and then disappear, that the most effective strike might not happen when you're there to see it, but long after you've gone. That shift, subtle as it may seem, carried forward into the future. The principles behind the clam influenced later designs, later strategies, later conflicts. Chemical time delay systems, magnetic attachments, covert placement tactics. All of these ideas continue to evolve, shaping how sabotage and special operations will be conducted in the decades that followed. But its greatest power wasn't technical. It was conceptual, the power of waiting. Because waiting changes the equation. A soldier on a bridge is vulnerable. A saboteur cutting rails is exposed. But a device placed quietly, activated carefully, and left behind. That device is no fear, no hesitation, no need to escape. It simply waits. And when the moment arrives, it acts with absolute certainty. Back on that night, 2:47 in the morning, September 18th, 1943, the train moving through darkness had no idea what it carried beneath it. The driver saw nothing unusual. The guards felt nothing out of place. The system functioned exactly as it was designed to, until it didn't. Until, at precisely the wrong moment, everything changed. And that's the essence of what made the clam so effective. Not its size, not even its explosive power, but its timing, its patience, its ability to exist unnoticed until the exact moment it mattered most. The Germans could move thousands of trains across occupied Europe every single day. They could guard bridges, patrol tracks, enforce discipline, and respond with overwhelming force to any visible threat. But they could never fully defend against something that had already been set in motion, something already attached, already activated, already counting down. Because by the time the explosion came, it was already too late. The people who placed it were gone. The moment had passed. The outcome was inevitable. And somewhere else on another line, another train, another quiet stretch of track in the darkness, another device was already waiting, counting, patient, unseen, because this wasn't just sabotage. This was sabotage that could wait, one delayed detonation at a time. And in that waiting lay a power the German war machine never truly solved, because sooner or later, somewhere along the line, the clock would run out,